March 1945. A German mother huddles in a basement clutching her daughter, listening to tank engines grow louder outside. She's been told for 12 years what will happen if black American soldiers find them. But when that door opens and a hand extends, not in violence but offering medicine, everything she believed about race, enemies, and truth itself is about to shatter. Frau Müller pressed her back against the cold basement wall, her daughter Anna trembling beside her. The 14-year-old hadn't eaten properly in 3 days. None of them had. The thunder of tank engines had been growing closer since dawn, and now they'd stopped, right outside. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise. Her elderly mother sat in the corner, lips moving in silent prayer, clutching the small bag they'd packed when the evacuation orders came. But they'd waited too long. The front line had moved faster than anyone expected. She thought of the leaflets. The Wehrmacht had distributed them weeks ago, official warnings printed on thin paper that felt like tissue between her fingers. The message had been clear and terrifying. If you see Negro American soldiers, evacuate immediately. Do not make contact. These are violent Untermenschen who cannot be reasoned with. Protect your daughters. Protect yourselves. The leaflets had piled up on kitchen tables across the Rhineland, passed from neighbor to neighbor, their warnings whispered in increasingly desperate tones as the Allied advance continued. Frau Müller had believed every word. Why wouldn't she? For 12 years, the information had been consistent. The schools taught it, the newsreels showed it, the radio broadcasts confirmed it, the Reich scientists explained it as biological fact. Some races were simply superior to others. That was nature. That was truth. And at the bottom of that hierarchy they'd been taught were African people and their descendants. The Americans even agreed, didn't they? Their own military segregated Negro soldiers into separate units. If the Americans themselves considered these men unfit to serve alongside white soldiers, surely that proved something. Now those segregated units were here, the 761st Tank Battalion. She'd heard the name whispered with fear. The Black Panthers, they called themselves. They'd smashed through the Siegfried Line, those massive fortifications that were supposed to protect the fatherland forever. They'd crossed the Rhine, and now they were in her city, on her street, outside her building. Heavy boots on the stairs above. Anna's fingernails dug into her arm. Her mother's prayers grew more urgent. This was it. This was the moment they'd been warned about. Frau Müller positioned herself in front of her daughter, a useless gesture of protection, but the only one available to her. The door at the top of the basement stairs creaked open. Footsteps descending. A flashlight beam cut through the darkness. The figure that emerged into the weak light filtering through the basement windows was a black American soldier, Tank Corps insignia visible on his uniform. He was young, maybe 25, with dust covering his face and exhaustion evident in his posture. Frau Müller's heart hammered so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She pushed Anna further behind her. The soldier stopped on the stairs, and for a long moment nobody moved. Then he spoke, in German, careful, accented, but understandable. "Ma'am, is anyone injured here? We have medical supplies. Do you need food or water?" The world stopped making sense. This wasn't the script she'd been given. This wasn't what 12 years of education and propaganda had prepared her for. She stared at him, unable to process the disconnect between expectation and reality. He was offering help. He was asking about injuries. He was treating them like human beings who mattered. Her mother found her voice first, a quavering response about Anna's fever, about the lack of food, about the wound on Frau Müller's own arm from shrapnel 3 days ago. The soldier called up the stairs in English, and another man descended, carrying a medical kit and canteens. They cleaned her wound with professional efficiency, gave them sulfur tablets for Anna, handed over emergency rations that felt impossibly heavy in Frau Müller's hands. The whole interaction lasted maybe 10 minutes. Then they left, moving on to check the next building, the next basement, the next family hiding in terror. When they were gone, Frau Müller sat down hard on the basement floor, staring at the bandage on her arm, the rations in her lap, her daughter already drinking water from a US Army canteen. Everything she thought she knew about the world had just been called into question by a simple act of human decency. If you're watching from anywhere in the world, drop a comment and let me know where you are. And subscribe, because this story gets even more incredible from here. To understand what happened in that basement and in thousands of similar encounters across Germany in the spring of 1945, you need to understand the machinery of dehumanization that had been running at full capacity for more than a decade. The Nazi regime didn't just govern Germany, it reconstructed reality itself for everyone living under its control. And one of its most fundamental reconstructions involved race. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 had codified racial hierarchy into German law. These weren't suggestions or guidelines, they were legal definitions of human worth. Jews, Romani people, people with disabilities and black individuals were systematically classified as inferior, as Untermenschen, subhumans. This classification had real consequences. It determined who could marry whom, who could hold certain jobs, who had legal rights, and ultimately who would live and who would die. But laws alone don't change how people think. For that, you need education. German children who entered school in 1933 were taught racial biology as scientific fact. Textbooks illustrated alleged racial hierarchies with charts and diagrams that looked as authoritative as any mathematics lesson. Teachers explained skull measurements and genetic theory with the same confidence they used to teach chemistry or geography. An entire generation grew up believing that racial superiority and inferiority were as real and measurable as height or eye color. The propaganda extended far beyond schools. Movie theaters across Germany showed films depicting non-Aryan peoples as dangerous or degenerate. Newspapers ran articles about racial purity with the same regularity they covered sports scores. Radio broadcasts reinforced these messages daily. Posters on street corners reminded citizens of their duty to maintain racial consciousness. It was total, comprehensive, and unrelenting, and it worked. When you control all information, when every source confirms the same message, when questioning that message can get you arrested, or worse, people believe. They have to believe. Skepticism requires access to alternative viewpoints, and alternative viewpoints didn't exist in Nazi Germany. The borders were closed, foreign publications were banned, listening to foreign radio broadcasts was a criminal offense. The Nazi narrative wasn't competing with other narratives. It was the only narrative available. By 1945, most adult Germans had been living inside this information bubble for 12 years. Younger adults had spent their entire adult lives there. Children like Anna had never known anything different. The idea that black people were inferior, dangerous, and essentially different from so-called Aryans wasn't controversial or debatable. It was simply how the world worked. It was truth. And then the Wehrmacht made that manufactured truth even more terrifying. As Allied forces advanced into Germany, military authorities distributed specific warnings to civilian populations about black American troops. These weren't subtle suggestions. They were explicit instructions printed on official leaflets and posted in public spaces. The warnings told German women to evacuate any area where Negro soldiers might arrive. They described these soldiers as violent and uncontrollable. They painted a picture of imminent danger that sent waves of panic through communities already devastated by years of war. The cynicism of this propaganda campaign was breathtaking. Nazi officials understood that the American military was segregated. They knew that black soldiers served in separate units, lived in separate barracks, and were systematically denied the same opportunities as white soldiers. And they weaponized that fact. Look, the propaganda said, even the Americans know these people are dangerous. Even the Americans separate them. Even the Americans treat them as inferior. If America, which claims to value equality, still segregates these soldiers, what does that tell you about their true nature? It was a masterpiece of manipulation. Take your enemy's own injustice, twist it, and use it to reinforce your own lies. The fact that American segregation was itself based on racism didn't matter. What mattered was that it could be exploited to make German propaganda seem more credible. See? Even they agree with us. For German women in early 1945, this propaganda hit especially hard because it came at a moment of extreme vulnerability. Their cities had been bombed, their homes were destroyed, food was scarce, medical supplies were running out. Their husbands, sons and brothers were dead, missing or fighting on collapsing fronts. They were exhausted, terrified, and desperate. And into that desperation came warnings about a new threat, a danger unlike any they'd faced before. Of course they believed it. What choice did they have? But here's what those women didn't know. Here's what the propaganda couldn't account for. The men they'd been taught to fear were not what they'd been told. The 761st Tank Battalion had been activated in March 1942 at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. It was one of the first all-black armored units in United States Army history. The men who joined came from across America, drawn together by a desire to serve their country, despite that country's systematic denial of their rights. They trained in the segregated South, where they couldn't eat in the same restaurants as white soldiers, couldn't use the same facilities, couldn't even receive training from white instructors without controversy. They trained hard anyway. They knew they'd have to be twice as good to get half the recognition. Their motto said it all. Come out fighting, not because they were violent or uncontrollable, as Nazi propaganda claimed, but because they knew they'd have to fight twice as hard, once against the enemy in front of them and once against the prejudice behind them. By November 1944, the 761st was in France, attached to General Patton's Third Army. They fought through some of the most brutal combat of the Western European campaign. They broke through the Siegfried Line, those supposedly impregnable fortifications along Germany's western border. They fought in the Battle of the Bulge. They liberated towns and cities, and they did it all while being treated as second-class soldiers by their own military. Then came March 1945, the Rhine crossing, the push into Germany itself. And suddenly, these men who'd been fighting for months found themselves not just as soldiers, but as representatives of everything Nazi propaganda had claimed to fear. They were entering towns where women had been specifically warned about them. They were liberating people who'd been taught to see them as subhuman. They were about to prove, through their actions, that 12 years of propaganda could be demolished in a single encounter. The first surrenders happened fast. Towns and cities that might have fought to the last bullet against white American units gave up without a shot when they saw the 761st approaching. Some historians have interpreted this as evidence that German forces were more afraid of black soldiers. But the reality was more complex. German military commanders by March 1945 knew the war was lost. They were looking for any excuse to surrender rather than see their towns destroyed. The presence of black American units sometimes provided that excuse, a way to surrender while claiming they had no choice against such a fearsome opponent. But it meant that the 761st often entered towns peacefully, rolling through streets lined with terrified civilians who'd barricaded themselves in basements and attics. And that's when something unexpected began to happen. That's when propaganda met reality. And reality won. The National W2 Museum in New Orleans holds archives of testimonies from this period, letters written years later, interviews conducted with German civilians, documents that capture what happened when fear gave way to experience. And what those sources show again and again is shock, disbelief, a complete disruption of everything these women thought they knew. In Bad Nauheim, a town about 20 miles north of Frankfurt, black tankers from the 761st distributed emergency rations to civilians who were starving, not as a strategic move, not because they'd been ordered to, but because they saw hungry people and had food to share. Women who'd hidden in cellars expecting violence instead received K-rations, canned goods, and medical supplies. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. One woman, whose testimony was recorded in 1947, described the moment a black soldier handed her daughter a chocolate bar. She said she didn't know how to process it. For 12 years, she'd been taught these people were animals, incapable of compassion or basic human decency. And here was one of them giving away his own rations to a German child. The daughter ate the chocolate, and the mother watched her entire worldview collapse. The sulfur tablets became particularly significant. Sulfur drugs were crucial for treating infections in an era before widespread penicillin use. German medical supplies had been devastated by years of war. Infections that should have been treatable were killing people. And black American medics were treating wounded Germans, including former Wehrmacht soldiers, with the same care they'd give to their own men. Think about that for a moment. These soldiers had every reason to feel nothing but hatred for Germans. They'd been fighting through France and Germany for months. They'd seen the concentration camps. They'd lost friends to German bullets and shells. And they were being denied basic rights by their own country while fighting to liberate Europe. Yet when they found wounded German civilians or soldiers, they provided medical care. They treated people who'd been taught to hate them with professionalism and basic human compassion. The discipline surprised German women almost as much as the kindness. The 761st maintained strict military order, even in the chaos of occupation. Unlike retreating German units, which by March 1945 were often looting from civilians and executing anyone suspected of defeatism, American units, including the 761st, followed rules of engagement and Geneva Convention protocols. There are documented accounts of black soldiers asking permission before entering German homes, asking if anyone needed help, checking if children were safe. This wasn't what German women expected from any occupying army, let alone from soldiers they'd been specifically warned about. The contrast with late-war German military behavior was stark and impossible to ignore. In Coburg, a city in northern Bavaria, soldiers from black American units set up aid stations where German civilians could receive medical treatment and food. Women who came initially out of desperate necessity found themselves treated with respect. Their injuries were bandaged. Their children were examined by medics. They were spoken to as human beings, not as conquered enemies, to be exploited or abused. One elderly woman refused to evacuate when the Americans arrived because she was too weak to walk. She thought she'd die alone in her apartment. Instead, black soldiers checked on her daily. They brought her food. They carried firewood up the stairs so she could heat her rooms. They did this for weeks, until civil administration was restored and other arrangements could be made. She wrote about it years later, and her letter is preserved in archives. She said she'd been taught to fear them. Instead, they treated her like she was their own grandmother. This pattern repeated across occupied Germany. Acts of kindness that directly contradicted everything the propaganda had promised, and words spread. Despite attempts by remaining Nazi authorities to control information, women talked to each other. They whispered in breadlines and at community wells. "Have you heard? They're not what we were told. They're helping people. They're behaving better than our own soldiers." But it wasn't just adults who noticed. Children, less thoroughly indoctrinated and more open to new experiences, reacted quickly. German children who'd been taught to fear black people found themselves receiving chewing gum and candy from black soldiers. They watched these men laugh, share stories, show pictures of their own families. Kids are remarkably good at detecting genuine kindness, and they recognized it here. A girl in Coburg, maybe 10 years old, asked her mother a question that captured the moment perfectly. Why did they say the Americans would hurt us? It was an innocent question, a child's observation. But it hit like a bomb, because the mother didn't have a good answer. How do you explain 12 years of lies when the truth is standing right in front of you, offering your daughter chocolate and making her laugh? Parents across occupied Germany struggled with similar conversations. Their children were questioning the propaganda faster than they were, and kids can be relentlessly logical. If we were told they're dangerous but they're giving us food, then what we were told was wrong. And if that was wrong, what else was wrong? Children asked these questions with the kind of clarity that adults, burdened by years of indoctrination, couldn't quite manage. The kindness continued in ways big and small. Black soldiers sharing cigarettes with German men who'd been their enemies days before. Medics treating sick children. Tankers helping to clear rubble from streets. Engineers restoring water supplies. None of this was strategic. None of it served a military purpose. It was simply human beings helping other human beings because that's what decent people do. But perhaps the most powerful moments came when German women recognized shared experiences. Motherhood became a bridge across everything that divided them. Black soldiers carried photos of their families back home, their wives, their children, their parents. And when they showed these photos to German women, something fundamental shifted. In Mannheim, a black medic was treating a German woman's son, maybe 8 years old, who'd been injured in bombing. The boy was crying. The medic worked carefully, talking softly in broken German, trying to comfort him. At some point, he pulled out a photo of his own son, about the same age. He showed it to the boy, then to the mother. And in that moment, she understood. He wasn't an Untermenschen. He wasn't a monster. He was a father who missed his child, treating her son with the same care he'd want someone to show his own. It was a small moment, a photo and a wound bandage in a destroyed city, but it carried enormous weight, because it proved that everything she'd been taught was a lie. This man loved his child the same way she loved hers. He worried about his family the same way she worried about hers. He was just a person, far from home, doing his job and trying to help where he could. The propaganda's entire structure rested on the premise that certain people were fundamentally different, fundamentally lesser, and that photo proved it was false. When one fundamental lie is exposed, the entire structure built on it becomes suspect. German women who'd accepted Nazi propaganda as truth suddenly had to confront the possibility that all of it was lies. If they lied about black Americans being violent animals, what else did they lie about? If this was propaganda, was everything propaganda? If these soldiers weren't what we were told, what about everything else the regime said? This psychological rupture happened individually, in thousands of separate moments across Germany, but its collective impact was profound. The women experiencing it didn't have a framework for understanding what was happening. They just knew that reality didn't match what they'd been taught, and that disconnect was deeply disturbing. Psychologists call this cognitive dissonance. It's the mental discomfort that comes from holding two contradictory beliefs simultaneously. On one hand, 12 years of consistent messaging from every authority figure in their society. On the other hand, their own direct experience. Both couldn't be true. Something had to give. People respond to cognitive dissonance in different ways. Some Germans stuck to denial. They convinced themselves that the black American soldiers they encountered were exceptions, unusually disciplined units that didn't represent the broader reality. These must be special troops, they told themselves, specially selected to present a false face. The propaganda must still be basically true. Others rationalized. They decided that the Americans were being strategic, showing false kindness as a tactic to pacify the population. Once the occupation was secure, they believed, the real nature of these soldiers would emerge. The kindness was temporary, a mask that would eventually come off. This allowed them to maintain their beliefs while explaining away contradictory evidence. But many, probably most, simply accepted the truth. They'd been lied to, systematically, comprehensively, for 12 years. Everything the regime said about race was false. And if that was false, what else was false? This acceptance was painful. It meant confronting personal complicity. It meant acknowledging that they'd believed things that led to the deaths of millions. It meant recognizing that their entire worldview had been constructed by liars. But it was also liberating, because reality, however harsh, was at least real. For mothers especially, the realization hit hard and deep. Motherhood creates a fundamental connection to universal human experience. When you've raised a child, you recognize that experience in others, regardless of their background. And many German mothers, watching Black American soldiers show photos of their families or interact gently with German children, recognize that bond immediately. There's a post-war testimony from a woman in Mannheim who articulated this perfectly. She'd believed the propaganda. She'd accepted the racial hierarchy as truth. But when she saw a black soldier carefully bandaging her son's wounded hand, talking softly to calm the boy down, she recognized something she couldn't deny. He was a father. He had children at home he loved the same way she loved hers. And in that recognition, 12 years of propaganda evaporated. She wrote later that she felt ashamed, not just for believing the lies, but for what those lies had been used to justify. This wasn't abstract philosophy. This was reality, forcing itself through layers of indoctrination. Individual human interactions doing what no amount of counter-propaganda could have achieved. Because you can argue with words, you can dismiss broadcasts and leaflets. But you can't argue with experience. You can't dismiss kindness shown to your sick child. You can't rationalize away food given to your starving mother. The collapse of Nazi racial ideology didn't happen all at once. It happened in these individual moments, scattered across occupied Germany, as women confronted the gap between what they'd been taught and what they experienced. And while there were certainly Germans who clung to their prejudices, who found ways to explain away the evidence, many didn't. Many accepted that they'd been wrong. And that acceptance, however painful, was the first step toward building a different Germany. But here's where the story becomes almost unbearably ironic. While German women were learning that Nazi racial ideology was a lie, while they were discovering through direct experience that black Americans were as human and decent as anyone else, those same black soldiers were returning to an America that still denied them basic rights. The segregation that Nazi propaganda had exploited as proof of black inferiority wasn't propaganda. It was real American policy. The 761st Tank Battalion fought as a segregated unit because the U.S. military wouldn't allow black soldiers to serve alongside white soldiers. These men who'd broken through the Siegfried Line, who'd crossed the Rhine, who'd helped liberate Europe from fascism, did so in an army that considered them second-class soldiers. And when the war ended, when they returned home, that discrimination followed them. Black veterans in the South couldn't vote, couldn't eat in certain restaurants, couldn't live in certain neighborhoods, couldn't attend certain schools. They'd fought against Nazi racism in Europe while experiencing American racism at home. They'd taught German women that racial hierarchy was a lie while their own country insisted it was truth. Some black soldiers found better treatment in occupied Germany than they'd ever received in America. German women, freed from propaganda, often treated them with more respect and basic human dignity than they'd experienced in their own hometowns. The irony was crushing. They'd crossed an ocean to fight totalitarianism and racism and found themselves living proof that both existed in their own country. The 761st Tank Battalion wouldn't receive official recognition for their service until 1978, 33 years after the war ended. For 3 decades, their contributions were downplayed or ignored. The unit received a Presidential Unit Citation in 1978, long after many of its members had died. The recognition came too late for them to fully enjoy it, too late to make up for decades of being written out of the story they'd helped write. Think about what that means. German women learned in 1945 that racial ideology was a lie. They experienced that truth directly. They saw it with their own eyes. Meanwhile, the men who taught them that lesson went home to a country that wouldn't fully acknowledge their humanity for another generation. German society began rejecting Nazi racial theories, while American society clung to its own versions. After the occupation, something interesting happened in Germany. The women who'd experienced these encounters raised children with different values. They taught their sons and daughters things their own parents hadn't taught them. They passed down stories about the Black American soldiers who'd shown them kindness, who'd treated them as human beings deserving of dignity and care. They made sure their children understood that what they'd been taught about race under the Nazis was not just wrong, but deliberately, maliciously false. This wasn't universal. Plenty of Germans maintained their prejudices, found new justifications for old hatreds, or simply refused to confront what they'd believed and done. But many didn't. Many women who'd hidden in basements expecting violence and received help instead became advocates for a different kind of society. They'd learned a lesson about propaganda and truth that they never forgot, and they tried to ensure their children learned it too. Post-war Germany's rejection of Nazi racial ideology was influenced by many factors. The revelation of concentration camp horrors, Allied denazification programs, economic rebuilding, and political restructuring all played roles. But don't discount the impact of individual encounters between German civilians and the soldiers they'd been taught to fear. Those moments mattered. They created personal experiences that no amount of propaganda could erase or rewrite. Years later, researchers interviewing German women about the occupation period heard similar stories again and again. Expectations of violence met with offers of food, assumptions of danger confronted with acts of kindness, propaganda promises contradicted by reality, and almost universally, these women expressed some version of the same realization. They'd been lied to about everything. That realization is the heart of this story. Not just that they were lied to about Black Americans specifically, but that they were lied to about the nature of truth itself. Nazi propaganda didn't just promote false ideas. It created a false reality where those ideas seemed reasonable, natural, and obvious. It took normal human prejudices and built them into an entire worldview, complete with pseudo-scientific justification and legal structures. It made discrimination seem not just acceptable but necessary and right, and it couldn't survive contact with reality. That's the crucial lesson. When German women actually met the people they'd been taught to fear, when they experienced genuine human interaction instead of propaganda caricatures, the entire structure fell apart. You can build elaborate lies, but they crumble when confronted with truth. You can create sophisticated theories of racial hierarchy, but they dissolve when you actually treat people as individuals. The men of the 761st Tank Battalion didn't set out to teach lessons about propaganda or human dignity. They were soldiers doing their jobs. They followed orders, fought battles, and tried to survive. When they showed kindness to German civilians, it wasn't part of some strategic plan to win hearts and minds. It was just decent people behaving decently because that's what decent people do. But in being themselves, in treating people with basic human respect regardless of who those people were or what they'd been taught, these soldiers demonstrated something profound. They proved that propaganda fails when confronted with genuine human interaction. They showed that ideology cannot withstand sustained contact with reality. They demonstrated that dehumanization only works when people remain abstract categories rather than actual individuals. Every time a German woman expected violence and received help instead, every time a child was given candy by someone they'd been taught to fear, every time a wounded person was treated with care by someone they'd been told was incapable of compassion, the propaganda lost. Reality won, truth won, human dignity won. This matters today because propaganda hasn't disappeared. The techniques have evolved, the technology has advanced, but the basic mechanisms remain the same: dehumanize the other, create categories of deserving and undeserving people, build a worldview where discrimination seems reasonable and necessary, use authority, repetition, and information control to make lies seem like truth. It's still happening all over the world, in different forms and toward different targets. But the antidote remains the same: personal interaction, individual human connection, seeing people as individuals rather than categories, treating others with dignity regardless of who they are or what you've been told about them. These simple acts have the power to demolish sophisticated propaganda systems because they force confrontation with reality rather than abstraction. The Black American soldiers who entered Germany in 1945 were fighting two wars. One against Nazi Germany, which threatened to remake Europe and the world according to its twisted vision of racial hierarchy, and one against the racism in their own country, which denied them equal rights while demanding they fight and die for freedom abroad. They won the first war decisively. The second took longer, and its victory remains incomplete. But in those encounters with German civilians, in those moments when propaganda met reality and shattered, they achieved something remarkable. They proved that human dignity transcends ideology. They demonstrated that kindness defeats dehumanization. They showed that truth, when given the chance, will overcome lies, not through argument or debate, but through simple human interaction, not through force or strategy, but through being decent people in a world built on indecency. When that door opened in Frau Müller's basement, when a Black American soldier offered help instead of harm, everything changed. Not just for her and her family, but for everyone who experienced similar moments across Germany that spring. They discovered that what they'd been taught for 12 years was a lie. That discovery didn't erase the damage those lies had caused. It didn't bring back the millions killed because of Nazi racial ideology, but it did prove that propaganda, no matter how sophisticated or comprehensive, cannot survive contact with truth. German women discovered that the people they'd been taught to fear were just people, capable of kindness and cruelty like anyone else, motivated by the same hopes and fears, loving their families the same way, wanting the same basic things. Human. That simple discovery, multiplied across thousands of encounters, helped destroy what 12 years of intensive propaganda had built. Because in the end, reality is stronger than lies. Always. The lesson endures. Propaganda fails when confronted with genuine human experience. Dehumanization collapses when we see individuals instead of categories. And dignity defeats discrimination every time, if we give it the chance. The men of the 761st Tank Battalion and other Black American units didn't just help defeat Nazi Germany, they proved, through their actions and their simple human decency, that racial ideology is a lie. They proved it to people who'd been taught otherwise their entire lives. They proved it in the most powerful way possible, not through arguments, but through actions, not through words, but through being themselves. That's what German women discovered when black soldiers arrived, that everything they'd been taught was a lie, that propaganda crumbles when confronted with truth, that human dignity cannot be destroyed by ideology because it exists in every individual action, every moment of kindness, every recognition of shared humanity. They discovered that 12 years of lies could be demolished in 10 minutes of reality, and that discovery changed everything. Remember these stories, share them. Make sure they're never forgotten. Because the struggle between propaganda and truth, between dehumanization and dignity, between lies and reality, never really ends. It just takes new forms. And the lesson these soldiers taught, often without meaning to, remains as vital today as it was in March 1945. Truth wins. Dignity wins. Humanity wins. Every single time we give it the chance. If this story opened your eyes to a piece of history you'd never heard before, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button so you never miss stories like this. These aren't just history lessons. They're reminders of truths we still need today. Drop a like if this impacted you, and leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and what part of this story hit you the hardest. Was it the propaganda machine? The moment reality shattered those lies, or the bitter irony that these soldiers went home to face discrimination after teaching Germans about equality? I read every comment, and I want to hear your thoughts. This is history that deserves to be remembered, discussed, and shared. So subscribe, like, comment, and let's make sure stories like this never get forgotten.